So in Iran, they have elections, they have different political parties. However, they have this thing called the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council is made up of the top Islamic scholars in the country, the most well-respected Islamic leaders. And before the election, they approve or disapprove the candidates. If you're running for president of Iran, you're running for the parliament, they make sure that you are in line with the teachings of the Islamic Revolution. And if you are, you can run for office. And if you win the election, you get your seat. And if you're not, you're disqualified. And when I was talking to the Iranians, I thought this was fascinating. They said, you know what, Caleb, we have the Guardian Council. We're not a pure democracy in Iran. We're not. We're a guided democracy. We're a democracy guided by our religious leaders, the religious leaders, the founders of our revolution, the people that overthrew the Western-backed dictator, that defeated the Iraqi invaders. They, oversee the democracy to make sure that the democracy flows from our religious tradition. They said, you have the same thing in America. Right? In America, you have a Guardian Council. It's called Wall Street. It's called Wall Street. In America, you can run for office. Anyone can run for office, but the big corporations decide who's a real candidate and who's not. And they vet, and they only allow people to be real candidates if Wall Street approves of them, right? If the big corporations and the mainstream media approve of a candidate, they get selected. They're allowed to be a real candidate. And if not, then they don't get treated as a real candidate. And we get to vote. But at the end of the day, we only get to vote for people. The only ones that have any chance are the ones that are approved by the people with the money. And they said, so which is better? Is it better to have a government that is guided by people who are the founders of your country, who are the most well-respected religious scholars, who overthrew a brutal dictator, who drove out foreign invaders? Or is it better to just happen to have the people be in charge, whoever just happens to have the most money? Right? And that is a really good point, because, and this is what you need to understand about imperialism. I'm talking about a lot of different topics. Imperialism, and the way imperialism works, it's often de facto rule, right? And this is something that it just drives me crazy. Imperialism rules, and it claims it's not ruling. It's only dictatorship when they are allowed to lose. As long as they get their way, it's not dictatorship. For example, right? In the 1990s, they said that Russia was a democracy. Right? In the 1990s, the Russian government was overthrown. You had the Russian, the Russian Federation was created. The Soviet Union was overthrown. And they elected this guy, Boris Yeltsin, to be the president. And then Boris Yeltsin started looting and destroying the Russian economy. And the Russian people then voted for another government. They voted for a parliament, a Duma, to stop him. And it was the Communist Party, and it was the Russian nationalist parties, and the National Salvation Front. They elected a government called the National Salvation Front to stop Boris Yeltsin. Then Boris Yeltsin dissolved the parliament, and he declared a state of emergency, and the parliament leaders wouldn't leave, and he sent the military to bomb the parliament. And the military, the actual Russian military, can you imagine this? That would be like in the United States if, they had there was a president who was very unpopular, but his term was still up, and they elected a new Congress, and the Congress was against him. And so the president just said, no, and he sent the military to go bomb Capitol Hill. Well, obviously, we would all say that's ridiculous. But the USA says that Russia in the 1990s was a democracy. They call that democracy. Why? Because Yeltsin was their guy. Their guy was in power. Their guy was dissolving the parliament, dissolving the Duma. Their guy was sending the military to crush people. So it was a democracy, right? Russia was a democracy in the 90s. How is that democracy? When the people elect a parliament that's going to stop what the leader is doing, and then he sends the military to, that's not democracy. And then everybody knows that the only reason Boris Yeltsin won the 1996 elections is because the USA meddled like crazy in the 1996 elections in Russia. And everybody knows this. Everybody knows this. There's a documentary film all about how Bill Clinton got Boris Yeltsin reelected. The USA was really scared that Zhuganov, the leader of the Communist Party, would win the election in Russia in 1996. So the USA You want to talk about foreign meddling? The USA brags. The cover of Time magazine bragged about how the USA did everything they could to make sure Boris Yeltsin got reelected. But we're told in the 1990s, it was a free country. But what happened then in 1999, Russia elected Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin had the majority of the votes. And Vladimir Putin was very popular. And in his presidency, he started fixing the economy by realigning the economy around oil and gas, state-controlled energy. And now we're told Russia's a dictatorship. Well, how is it a dictatorship now and it was a democracy before? This is bullshit, right? It's dictatorship when they lose. And as long as they're winning, it's a democracy. And that's how it is all over the world, right? And so, like, they say here in America, we have totally free elections. It just so happens whoever has the money rules. But in Iran, where they have the Islamic Republic and the Guardian Council choosing the candidates, that's dictatorship. Well, and this gets to what Lenin talked about in his very important book, right? Which is a very important book, which is something that it's hard for a lot of communists to really understand. This is a very important book. It's not got a good name, but it's an important book to read. Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky by Vladimir Lenin. This is a very, very important book because they said the same thing about the Bolsheviks. They said the exact same thing about the Bolsheviks, right? What we have to understand is that pure democracy, real democracy, like absolutely pure, free democracy, is only going to be possible once you have total socialism. Until then, those who control the means of production, those who own the banks and the factories and the industries, are going to defend their control over it, and they're going to use their control over the means of production to rule. And the only way you'll ever get a pure democracy is when you have full socialism. Okay? And that's what people don't get. And that yes, the Soviet Union was not a pure democracy. It was not, right? They had one party, the Communist Party. They tried to have other parties, but eventually they had the Communist Party. In the Soviet Union, they didn't have total free speech. I mean, the Soviet Union was not a pure democracy, but there won't be pure democracy. And that's the point this book is making. There will not be pure democracy anywhere until you have total socialism in the world, until the working class until you have eliminated the rule of profits, until there's enough wealth and abundance, until you have global socialism moving toward that ultimate stage of communism, there's not going to be pure democracy anywhere. There's an element of dictatorship in all societies. However, under capitalism, that dictatorship is whoever has the most money. In anti-imperialist and socialist societies, it is the revolutionary working class forces, okay? And that's what you have to understand. And that's what Kautsky did not understand. And that's what social democrats do not understand. Social democrats believe that we're just trying to make democracy come true. That's what social democrats believe. They say that, America claims to have a government of, by, and for the people. And, they're lying, but we're going to make it come true. No, you're not going to make it come true. You're going to bring the working class and the revolutionary organizations to power to establish socialism so eventually it can come true. But you're not trying to perfect the system that currently exists, right? You're not trying to perfect the system that currently exists to make it true to its principles, right? You are waging class warfare. And that this is hard for a lot of people to understand, right? That Iran is not a pure democracy, and they do not claim to be a pure democracy. The Chinese system is not a pure democracy, right? It is a revolutionary democratic dictatorship, they call it, meaning that it is the Communist Party leading the Chinese people, right, to enact their will through the leadership of the Communist Party, but there are undemocratic elements to it, right? And that as long as there are different classes in society, those classes are going to contend for power. And as those classes contend, the idea of having a pure democracy that is just a completely open, free democracy is an illusion. And this is something that a lot of social democrats don't understand. And that's And again, they say that it's pure democracy when they win. And then they look at countries that admit they are not pure democracies. Iran is not a pure democracy. Cuba is not a pure democracy. China, North Korea, these are not pure democracies. These are countries that are guided. Their democracy is guided, but it's not guided by just whoever happens to have the most money. It's guided by the forces that have led the revolution, that have driven out the foreign invaders, that have built a society based on their principles. But yes, those forces are guiding the democracy, and that the only way we will ever get pure democracy is when we've completely eliminated poverty in the world, when we've completely eliminated any form of class antagonism, when there's enough wealth to go around. At that point, inequality will start to fade away and we can talk of pure democracy. But as long as you have class society, and as long as some people own the means of production, as long as there's mass amounts of inequality, you are not going to have democracy. Right. And this is the myth of bourgeois democracy. And this is really important to understand. And I always use the Iranian Guardian Council as a great way of explaining that. Right. Iran is more democratic than the United States, even though the United States in form is more democratic. On paper, the USA is way more democratic than Iran on paper. Right. In the United States, there's no Guardian Council. Anyone can run for office. Whoever has the most votes wins. But we all know that the people with the money rule. In Iran, it's not as purely democratic on paper. In Iran, they say, look, our democracy, we are led by the Islamic Republic. We are led by the supreme leader. This is not pure democracy. However, they are led by a revolutionary government that is constantly under the attack of the imperialists and relies on a very well-organized population to have their back. They have Basij councils in every neighborhood. They have these revolutionary committees that back them up. And that government, right, that government in Iran desperately depends on having the support of the population. And so even though it's not purely democratic, it's way more beholden to the people than our government is. The Islamic Republic bends over backwards to get average people on the street to have their back and support them. And if they didn't have that, they would lose in a minute. Our government doesn't give two shits about whether we support them or not, because they just, but the only way the Islamic Republic can stay in power is through this network of people in Iran called Basij councils that are loyal to them, that carry out their goals on the community level, that teach classes on their ideology, that are walking through the neighborhood and trying to make sure that everything is being carried out according to their Islamic teachings. The only way they can stay in power is by having a huge millions and millions of people who go out and their mission is to keep them in power and carry out their goals. That's the only way they can stay in power. Whereas our government doesn't give two shits about whether we support them, because the people with the money support them and, they can do whatever they want, right? And that's the difference, right? So what is democracy? Democracy is the rule of the people. And no country anywhere in the world is democracy. And the only way you're going to get a real democracy is when you ultimately have a world without poverty, when you've eliminated scarcity, etc. But if democracy is rule of the people, even though these countries are not as democratic on paper as we are, they are more democratic because the government has a much closer relationship with the population and is so dependent on the people having their back. And the population is so heavily involved in the process of governing, it's more democratic. And that is a hard thing for a lot of people to understand. Just because you have free speech doesn't make it democratic. Just because everyone gets to vote doesn't make it democratic. Democracy means, are the people ruling? And in many countries like North Korea, like Iran, like Cuba, there is way more democratic participation. There is way more dependent on a loyal population. The people are ruling way more than they are in the West. And that is something that it's very hard for people to understand. But you all are smart. You're a smart audience and you're learning from me. And we've engaged with all these ideas together. And so we're learning.